Well, I am so pleased to be here with you to discuss some of my work as it relates to social justice and school mathematics. So let me introduce myself. My name is Robert Berry, and I am the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona. I am also a professor of mathematics education at the University of Arizona as well. And today I will be talking about mathematics teaching and learning focused on social justice. But before I jump into the presentation, I actually want to do a couple of acknowledgments. And because I'm in Tucson, Arizona, and more importantly at the University of Arizona, I respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous people. Today, Arizona is the home of 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being the home of the Odom and the Yaqui nations. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. I also want to do a labor acknowledgement. I also acknowledge and pay respect to the lives of the African people and their descendants, forced to dedicate their labor and lives as enslaved people. These enslaved people built and sustained the everyday life of many communities in the United States. I reflect on the injustices committed to enslaved people. I honor their stories, told and untold, and their descendants and elders, past, present, and emerging. I believe that these acknowledgments are significantly important as we dig into the work of social justice. And you think about the intersection between social justice and school mathematics, acknowledging space and acknowledging the foundational aspects of why some of us are in this space. And so for me, labor and land acknowledgments are significantly important because I come from a legacy of people who are impacted from the acknowledgments I just kind of put forward here. So our session today will focus on two essential questions. How do you infuse, or how can I infuse social justice into mathematics learning? And what work must I do for myself to prepare myself and my students to engage in social justice and mathematics? And in doing so, the plan I hope to follow through this session follows this. I will talk about four critical reasons to respond to social injustice. And I'm using social injustice in a way because it models some work I've done with colleagues around the country. And I'll unpack that a little bit later. I think we have to define what we mean by social justice. There are varying definitions out in the field, and I want to put forward one definition as we think about what we mean by social justice. I will unpack the social justice math lesson framework and how this framework might be useful as one thinks about how they might teach lessons, how they might engage in the lessons around this, or even think about units as one engage around this. And I will touch on what matters, and when I say what matters, in terms of teaching math or social justice, I think, those are things that we have to be reflective upon as we think about this work as well. And finally, I want to provide you with some resources. There's some fabulous resources out there that I think that will be helpful as one goes on this journey to think about the intersection between social justice and mathematics teaching and learning. So let me acknowledge a couple of things. I have been a co-editor on two books, but this work that I'm talking about today comes from one of those books. I co-edited with the gentlemen that you see on the screen, Basil Conway, Brian Lawyer, and John Staley. And we focus on a book the title of the book is High School Mathematics Lesson to Explore, Understand, and Respond to Social Injustice. And so I'm leaning into this work pretty heavily as for this presentation today. But before we actually jump into this, I actually want to talk about one of the lessons that came out of that book. And, just to kind of go back to the book, that book it starts off with what does it mean to teach for math for social justice, define social justice, provides a framework, And then there are a series of lessons. And so I want to start with this lesson. And the reason why I want to start with this lesson, because I think it helps us frame when we say social justice, it contextualizes it and what it might mean, and where is the intersection between social justice and math. And so we're focusing on high school mathematics here, but I hope this, lesson can help frame that. And so this lesson is called a false positive. And on the screen here, I'll let you read for yourself here on the screen the false positive. And this is kind of introduction to when we say false positive. You should see a QR code on the screen as well. And that QR code actually, if you have a device and you kind of scan it on that QR code, it will provide you with the actually lessons and the activity that wrap around this lesson, a false positive. So just imagine people in many occupations, such as police officers, air traffic controllers, are subjected to random drug tests. And such testing is done on the ground that employees' work affects safety of the general public. So the idea, when I did this with students, we kind of contextualize this. However, drug testing might be controversial, and I argue that in some communities this is debated. One objection is the concern to the unfair consequences stemming from the fact that the tests are not perfect or imperfect. And so what happens if someone who is not a drug user but tests positive? What are the consequences? And this is where the social justice intersect with that. The consequences may be that the person loses their job. The consequences as a result of losing their job, it has an impact on one's family, and it has an impact probably on broadly a community of people. And so this is the context of this lesson. And so here's the actual task. And so and the task is set up in a scenario. So think about the scenario. Let's assume that a certain drug test is 98% accurate. So it's 98% accurate, meaning that 2% of the time it is inaccurate. This means that 98% of people who are given a drug test will test positive. And 98% of the people who do not use drugs will test negative. So if you're a drug user and it's testing for a particular drug, 98% of those people who are drug users will test positive. And if you're not a drug user and they're testing for that particular drug, 98% of those people will test negative. So let's assume that only 5% of a population on a job engages in drug use. So here's the question. If a person tests positive, how likely is it that they actually use drugs? And that is the question that when I did this with students that we wanted to kind of unpack. And so this sets it up into, do you think such a test should be used? And so the question is, what's the mathematics behind this? How can we engage around the mathematics as we explore this context and then answer this question? Should drug testing be used? And I also want to say that there's no clean right or wrong answer to this. The objective is to use mathematics to mathematize one's world, to mathematize one's community, to read and write the world. And how does mathematics provide us with some evidence as we kind of think about, making a case? In this case, making a case for whether or not drug tests are fair. So here, I just want to unpack this. If we were in person, I would unpack this differently, but I'm just going to lay it out. Okay, so here we go. So let's just say we assume that 5% of a population uses drugs. We know that 5%, so based on the scenario that we set up, 98% of that 5% would test positive and 2% will test negative. So you can see this as we kind of lay it forward. So 5% use drug, 98% of that 5% would test positive and 2% would test negative. So let's look at this. So this means that about 4% of that so 4% are true positives, and 0.1% will be false negatives. That means that they are drug users and they will test negative, and that is a false negative. And if we put this to a population of 100,000 people, this means of that 5%, which is about 5,000 people, right? 4,900 people of that 5% would test positive, which we would, which seemed to be reasonable as we kind of think about this. And then, but 100 of that 5% who are drug users will test negative, which will be a false negative. So I hope that kind of sets up a scenario as you think about, should we, should we engage in drug testing? So let's think about non-drug users. That means 95% of the given population do not use this drug or use drugs. And if we think about this, of that 98%, 2% because 2% will test positive because the drug test is only 98%, of that 95% of non-drug users, 2% would test positive because the drug test is only 98% effective, and 98% will test negative, which would be accurate because that 95% of the population are not drug users. So let's kind of look forward on this. This means about 1% of that population, 1.9%, will be a false positive. Will be a false positive, meaning that a non-drug user but tests positive because the drug test is only 98% effective, which means 2% will be a false positive. And 93% will be a true negative. So non-drug user, use the drug test, 93.1% will be a true negative. So let's put this to a population. Again, we have of 100,000 people. This means that for non-drug users, 1,900 people who do not use drugs will have a false positive, and 93,100 people who are not drug users will be a true negative. So given this data, the question that comes to mind is, so what are the implications of this? And the reason why we kind of engage in this task and the social justice implication that wraps around this task kind of humanizes this mathematics. While one might say, oh, drug testing, a drug testing company says the test is 98% effective, when we begin to humanize that and put people into these spaces, the question is, 1,900 people may, and this is only for a sample population of 100,000 people. Imagine million people, imagine millions of people. What does that mean for families and the implication of one that might lose their job if they are false positive, the impact on families, the impact on communities, those kinds of things. So let's take this a little bit further. This was the question of the scenario I set up earlier, just kind of as a reminder. But if I take this a little bit further and we look at only the positives, if a person tests positive, how likely are they actually use drugs? So if we go back, a true positive, you remember, 4,900 true positive, they use drugs, they test positive. 1,900 are false positive. They don't use drugs, but they test positive. We put that population together, that means there's a total of 6,000, and a sampling of 100,000 people, that total of 6,800 total positive, meaning 4,900 true positive, 1,900 false positive, giving us 6,800 total positive. This means of that population who tests positive, only 72% of that population are true positives. So the question, so here's some of the math to support some questions that one may have. And so, again, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's the question that we want to raise up as we think about a sampling of the population, and is 98% a claim of 98% effective um, tests, and what's the impact of that 2% as well, who are false positive. So I wanted to provide that math task to kind of lead us into this broader conversation on social justice. Now, I hope this task can be kind of in the background as you think about this. And I want you to just kind of reflect. What comes to your mind when you think about social justice in mathematics classroom? It matters the kinds of tasks, it matters the kind of social justice kind of framing that you want to engage our students around. So, what do we mean by social justice? Now, I think there are four aspects of social justice that is provided by the United Nations, and this is a definition that I borrowed, my co-editors have borrowed as we kind of work through this. What is social justice? There are four aspects: access, participation, empowerment, and human rights. And so, access, this is the fair distribution of human and material resources. Participation, creating equitable opportunities for people across to access information and fully be participatory in decisions that impact or affects their lives. So having access, empowerment, is the sense of urgency and taking advantage of opportunities society affords one, and the actual elimination of oppression. And then this fourth kind of framing of is human rights. The belief that, all humans have the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion, and the right to work and to education. So if we think about social justice around these framings, this is what kind of drove my thinking, and it drove us as we are engaged around our texts around what we mean by social justice. But then how does social justice and using social justice in mathematics and using math to respond to, and we use the term social injustice to respond. So there are four framings around this: to build an informed society, to connect math with students and cultural and community histories as valuable resources. So who they are, whom they are, whose they are and who they are in terms of their community and their identities. Empower students to confront and solve real world mathematics as a tool, math as a tool to confront unjust contexts, and then help students learn to use math as a tool for democracy and creating a more just society. And so I want to unpack all four of these. The first one, building an informed society. Building an informed society, and I highlight some key points here. Students must become better informed. How do we provide, when we say better informed, using math to help them understand the thing that they want to mathematize as information, being informed about those things that impact their lives, but not only their lives, but may impact others as well. So the idea of building empathy, it is paramount that students connect to injustices. When we say connect to injustices, not only just in their community, but in their schools and in the country more broadly, and become aware of the experiences, how injustices are experienced by different people who may be different from them socially and culturally. And so this reminds me of the work around windows, sliding doors, and mirrors. Building an informed society provides a window. It offers, a view of others' experience. Sliding doors allow us to enter story to become a part of the world. And the mirror reflects on one's culture and helps one to build their own identity. So that's the kind of the first framing. The second framing that we kind of touched in on is connecting math with students' cultural and community history. So the history. Oftentimes math is detached from context. Doing math for social justice provides a context for us to connect. And that is significantly important. Having that connection to not only the experiences of people, but the community and the cultural resources of people. Students bring with them a wealth of knowledge in informal mathematics. And that is significantly important. How do we create opportunity for them to access, that wealth of knowledge that is significantly important? And finally, building cultural competence. Cultural competence is significantly important as we think about, um, how one's identity intersect with others, and building the competence to understand that we live in a world where there are multiple people operating in that space, and having an understanding of who's in the space in terms of building culture competence. The third thing I want to touch in is the idea of this real world challenges. It empowers students to confront and solve real world challenges. This is where critical consciousness comes into play. When we say critical consciousness, this is the idea of using math as a tool to analyze, critique, and confront unjust contexts. And finally, the fourth thing here is math as a tool for social change. How can we use math? How do you mathematize? Use math as a tool for social change allows students to become actors. When we say actors, it empowers them to transform inequities using their mathematical knowledge, using their mathematical thinking to address social change. So when we think about teaching math for social justice, it helps us, broaden the purpose of learning mathematics. Too often, when we teach mathematics, we teach it in a space that is decontextualized, it's not connected, and providing context and providing opportunities for students to be critical and use mathematics in a critical way as a tool helps us and helps students broaden the purpose for why they are learning mathematics. And I think it helps us as educators to do that as well. So why, developing deep mathematical understanding? If we go back to the false positive, understanding proportionality, understanding, the impact of proportionality it can be a context for students to connect the math to this context. I think this idea of professional opportunities. I think I mentioned earlier to understand and critique the world. But the thing I touch in on and I really love about this work is that I think it gives students the opportunity to experience wonder, joy, and beauty of mathematics. When we say wonder, joy, and beauty, it is that math is why do we do math? We do it in a contextual way to support students' thinking, to be curious, to be engaging, and then just see the beauty that math can provide us with the tool to be to confront social justice issues. So this is a quote from the text, and this quote from the text is significantly important for me as we think teaching math for social justice is more than lessons that teachers might implement in their classroom. It's about relationships they build. It's about the teaching practices that help them do that. And it's the goal to develop positive social, cultural, mathematical identities. It allows students to be authors, actors, and doers. And if we can think about how we have a mathematical opportunity for students to be authors, meaning authoring ideas. And if you go back to the false positive, they can now author ideas using the math to support their positionality, whether drug test is fair or not fair. They become actors because they engage with one another. And the doers of mathematics is okay, what more math do I need to do to continue to support my argument? And what other data, math or non-math data that I might use to support an argument? So I'm just going to skip this a little bit. Well, I'm not going to skip it. The only thing I would say about this here is who are essential workers. And I want to put this in the context of COVID because this came up in work that I've done with students, and the idea of this graph actually came from newspaper. It came out in the New York Times, and was interesting data because we can use when we think about lessons and social justice, there are things that are in our spaces that we actually can use to kind of engage around social justice. So if you look at this table here, is that it shows the percentage of women in different occupations who are essential workers. And the question one might ask is, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And what impact does this have on your community? And and I'll be brief here. You know, the question that came up when I work with students on this is that, okay, what occupations are on this list and which ones are not on this list, right? And that's significantly important. And then you look at the percentage of women within these occupations. You know, as an educator, one that kind of really jumped out to me is that, well, teachers are not on this list. And what does that mean? And because teachers are excluded from that list, if you look at the overall essential workers, does that increase from 52% total to a larger number? And what might that mean? And the question might be, in having a critical lens on this, particularly working with students, why are some occupations included and why are some occupations excluded? And then we can begin to think about, a task I put forward for students is, using this data, how might we what do we need to know? What other occupation we might consider, and how might the data shift? Or we can ask, well, why would one present the data as is currently presented? And what's the intentionality about doing that? And so the point I'm hoping to make here, that the lesson doesn't have to be kind of a big, broad lesson. It can be those things that help attune students to have a critical lens on data or on information that they're bombarded with in social media spaces, news spaces, and others, but also having a mathematical lens on that to engage in question. So what I want to do is touch on a couple of things here, and I want to touch on a couple of elements for social justice and the framework. And here you should see I would say, an image. And in this image is the framework for elements for social justice mathematics lesson framework. And I want to kind of unpack a few of these as quickly as I can. And so you'll see this triangle in the middle. And the triangle in the middle is social and mathematical understanding. So the framework what types of understanding will this support? Math content, math practices, and social justice standards. Social mathematical investigation is, I will always say, if you engage in the social justice and mathematics, math should be kind of drive the investigation. We are still attuned to making sure students engage in mathematics and learning the mathematics that they need to know to be able to use math as a tool to critique and understand the world. The third largest part of that larger framework is social and mathematical reflection. If you engage in the social justice math work, your students should have the opportunity then to reflect about the mathematics, the social issue, and how the two inform one another. And so a lesson is just not a lesson to make sure that students do math and then engage in discourse around it, but also creates a reflection. And finally, as a result, engaging in social justice math lesson, that there should be some type of action or some type of product that results from that engagement. So students are just not left with, they've done the math. So what's the next step? So the question is, what's the next step from the false positive lesson? What students should engage around, from the false positive lesson? It might be, looking into, kind of news and public spaces to understand the impact of drug testing it may have on people who may have tested false or have a false positive, or just drug testing in general and how drug testing are weaponized. But so when we think about the product, it should, provide three frameworks: identity, how we view ourselves; diversity, how we view others; and perspective, again, that windows and mirrors perspective; and justice, the idea of fairness, power relationship, and implicit bias. So when we think about the product that students will make as a result of engaging in these lessons, those are the three things I think we should help students develop and understand and engage in around those products. So The question one might ask is, what issues of social injustice might your students be interested to better understand and act upon? So think, and then what's the math potential of the topic? And so think about students that you work with, and what are some of the issues around the social justice, and then the intersection of mathematics. These questions and these investigations, can be challenging, but the interesting thing around this is I think there are resources that we can lean into. And when we think about leaning into those resources, here are a few resources. So what can I do? What can I do to learn more about teaching math for social justice? You see the figure on the screen here is standards-based math instruction, understanding what that means, complex instruction, culture relevant pedagogy, critical math education, and teaching math for social justice. I want to unpack this a little bit more in the sense of what are some of those resources. Principles, the actions, if you're familiar with NCTM and their work, that helps us understand what standards-based math instruction will look like. But strength in numbers is another resource, and that's Lonnie Horn's work and others around what a complex instruction. When we say complex instruction helps us understand status relationships in classrooms. It helps us create multidimensional classroom where students are recognized to have mathematical ability. We always assume that students want to engage in mathematics. They have abilities to engage in mathematics, and where we can intersect, the experiences that we need for students to engage in those things. Gloria Laston Billings' work around culturally relevant pedagogy, particularly her book, The Dream Keepers, and then critical math education. Rico Stein's work in and around, the world and mathematics is one, but one that's not a math text, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Ferri, is another resource. And then Teaching Math for Social Justice, the social justice work that's done here as well. So those are a few resources. Finally, I will share with you, there's another QR code here on the screen. And on the screen, while I know it's a little bit small, this will get you to, 4 lessons in the text that I shared that I edited with my colleagues earlier. So I invite you to take chime in on that QR code, and that you get access to a couple of lessons so that you can get the framework and the cadence around, some of this work as well. And then finally, I'm going to call this a catch-all. I created a Padlet, and this Padlet is a catch-all for things that I've been using in my own work to capture lessons and resources, other types of things that one can, as a resource for social justice and math. I'm not making any claims about the quality of those things. Some of them are excellent, excellent resources, and some are things that I'm curious about. So consider this as a working resource, because I use this for my own work, but I'm making it available and I've always made it available for people. So my Padlet on social justice and math resources is available for anyone who wants to download and get access to those resources. So I'm coming up on time. And what I would like to say is just keep in mind, as one engage around these teaching math for social justice, this is not something that you should do in every lesson, every week, all the time. It might just take up one, maybe per marking period, or one per semester, see what happens there. And then think about the questions and the intersection between your students and the mathematics. But I will, on the screen here, you see there are social justice standards that have been developed by Teaching Tolerance, and there is a resource for fostering discourse. These are incredible resources as one think about as they engage in the lessons and the kinds of discourse that might come up with students as they engage in classrooms around social justice. So I'm going to stop there and just close this out. Again, I hope I've been able to answer the central question: how do you infuse social justice in the math classroom, and the work that you must do to prepare yourself and your students in engaging this work. So I invite you to take advantage of the resources, and I look forward to engaging questions. So thank you so much. Wow. So I know we have a little bit of time. I'm looking at the chat here to see if there's any questions that come up. I just, oops, just want to make myself available to answer any questions that you may have about any of the work that we've discussed. So feel free to drop any questions in the chat. So let's see. I see a question. Would you suggest teachers who are interested in building capacity to teach mathematics focused on social justice independently delve into the resources, or should they create communities? Excellent questions. I do think that we should, teachers should engage in community work. I mean, this is how I took up the work around teaching mathematics for social justice. It has been in community with other teachers and other educators. And quite honestly, one of the things that would be significantly important to understand the context in which you would engage in this work. And I say understanding the context, being in community with others, provide not only some, the contextual factors one need to be able to know and understand and do the work, but also builds allyships and advocacy space as well. Because sometimes, I mean, when we think about the broader work around social justice, there has been some pushback. And so to develop allyship, partnerships, community building, all of that will be significantly important. So I just want to, I know we're pushing up on time. So I just want to thank everybody for, just attending. And um, I appreciate the work. I appreciate you engaging in this work. And I appreciate, feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions. My email is easy. It's rqberry at arizona.edu. rqberry at arizona.edu. Would love to connect, be in community with you, and learn with you, and also be a support to you.